Okay, Matthew 15, we're starting with verse 21. Here's what it says. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." He answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. Up until this point in the gospel, most of Jesus' ministry has taken place among the Jewish people. The crowds that he taught along the Sea of Galilee, the people that he healed in Capernaum and in many of the surrounding villages, the confrontations that Jesus has had with the scribes and the Pharisees and the synagogues and in other places, all of this activity has been centered on the Jewish people, with the exception of one very brief trip that Jesus took with the disciples to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, where he healed 2 demon-possessed men. But other than that, all of Jesus' focus up to this point has been on teaching and ministering to the Jewish people. And so when Matthew says here in verse 21 that Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon, it's important that we recognize that this is a very significant shift that is taking place, almost like a plot twist in a movie. Here we have the Jewish Messiah ministering among the Jewish people, and now all of a sudden he's going away from there to a region that is inhabited mostly by Gentiles or non-Jewish people, which, by the way, for us Gentiles here this morning, this is really good news. Thank God that Jesus didn't just minister to the Jewish people, but he ministered to us Gentiles as well. And thank God that this progression continues to the uttermost parts of the earth, all the way to New Jersey, right? But the gospel didn't go to the ends of the earth right away, did it? That took some time. And if you look through the book of Acts, you'll see how all of that plays out and how God raised up an apostle who was not one of the original 12, a man named Paul, who was largely responsible for initiating that sending of the gospel to the Gentiles. But all of that happens later. And it happens later by design. As Paul himself says in Romans chapter 1, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." And by Greek, Paul doesn't mean just people who happen to come from Greece, but all Gentiles. Okay, all people who are not of Jewish descent. So the fact that the gospel goes to the Jews first is by design. When Paul says it's to the Jew first, that speaks to the priority of the Jews when it comes to the gospel, and the fact that God elected them or chose them to be his people. Now, some folks have a problem with that God actually chooses people. But Paul also reminds us in chapter 2 of his letter to the Ephesian church that by our very nature, all of us are children of wrath, meaning all of us are born rebellious toward God. And so thank God that he chooses us, because apart from that, apart from his initiative, none of us would be following Jesus today, not a single one of us. And so God takes the initiative and he calls us to himself, and the first people that God called to himself were the Jewish people. And so the gospel went to the Jews first because God chose them. But also because, as Paul says in Romans 1, the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. See, being Jewish doesn't save a person. Only the gospel does. If simply being born Jewish saved a person from their sins, then the Jews wouldn't need the gospel. Only us Gentiles would. But as Paul says here in Romans 1, they do need the gospel just like everyone else does. And according to God's plan, the gospel went to them first. And later on, the gospel will go to us, who are the Gentiles. Now, all of this is important for us to understand if we are going to make sense of this story. Why in the world would Jesus call a poor, desperate woman and her sick child dogs? Because let's be honest, when you think about Jesus and you think of how he was with people and how he related to people and how he cared for people, this story probably doesn't rank in your top 10 favorites, does it? Maybe the story about Jesus healing the man who was born blind, or the one about Jesus calling the little children to come to him. That's always a favorite image of Jesus. Or maybe even the story of Jesus coming to the aid of the woman who was caught in adultery. But this story, I'm guessing this story doesn't make your top 10 list. In fact, if anything, it's probably been crossed off your list. I don't mean you've crossed it out of your Bibles or anything like that. I just mean it's a story that you really don't think too much about. Maybe you even consider it an anomaly, right? Like, I don't know what was going on with Jesus in that story, but that is not the Jesus that I know. Well, maybe the Jesus you know has been photoshopped a little bit, made to look like someone that he's not. Because Jesus did say these things, this story did happen. And so if we want to be able to see Jesus better, like Eric talked about last week, we need to behold him in his word. We need to see him in stories like this one so we can see him as he truly is. Now, part of the problem with stories like this is we come to them with a lot of misconceptions, and those misconceptions cause us to misinterpret what's actually going on. And the first misconception that people sometimes bring to a story like this is the idea that everyone who comes to Jesus deserves to get what they ask for. Why should it be up to Jesus to decide who gets healed and who doesn't, or who gets delivered and who doesn't? Everybody should get what they ask for. That's only fair. But see, that's not how it works. Jesus is Lord, not us. And not only that, oftentimes what I ask him for isn't what I really need anyway. Or it's not all that I need. Like the paralyzed man that we read about back in chapter 9. If you remember from that story, Jesus healed the man's spirit first by forgiving him of his sins, something he didn't ask for. And then he gave him what he and his friends asked for and healed his body. Or like the woman with the issue of blood. It wasn't enough that her physical condition was healed. Jesus sought her out afterwards because he wanted her to know what it was that really healed her. That it wasn't just touching the fringe of her garment, of his garment, but it was her faith in him that truly made her well. In the same way, I think we need to assume that maybe there's something going on in this encounter between Jesus and this woman that is more than just a request to heal her daughter. Now, I think we get a clue as to what might be going on here when we look at Matthew's description of the woman. He says here in verses 21 and 22 that she was a Canaanite woman from the region of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon are Gentile cities that were often condemned by the Old Testament prophets because of their greed and materialism and pagan worship. But Matthew makes it a point to emphasize the fact that this woman isn't just a Gentile who is from this region, but she is also a Canaanite. Now, the Canaanites are mentioned over 150 times in the Bible, and they were known to be a very wicked and idolatrous people. They were some of Israel's most bitter enemies. So needless to say, the Canaanites and the Jews weren't exactly on good speaking terms, which is probably why the disciples were anxious to have Jesus send her away. But instead, Jesus uses this opportunity to teach this Canaanite woman and to teach his disciples a very important lesson. And what is Jesus' favorite method of teaching, especially from what we've seen him do over the past few chapters? What form of teaching does Jesus enjoy to use? Parables, right? And that is exactly what Jesus is doing here. See, Jesus isn't calling this woman a dog. He's telling her a parable. You don't look convinced. That's good. You should be skeptical. Skeptical is good. Let's look at this again and see what Jesus says here. Verse 26, and he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now think about this for a second. Did the woman in this story ask Jesus for bread? No. She asked him to heal her daughter, right? So this is a parable. The bread is the gospel, the salvation of God that frees us from our sin, that heals us, that delivers us. The children represent God's people, the children of Israel, and the dogs are us, right? The Gentiles. So if you're offended this morning because you think Jesus is calling this woman a dog, maybe you'll feel better to know that he's calling you one too. Because if you happen to be a Gentile like me, that's who you are in this parable. You are one of the dogs. Now, if it makes you feel any better, Jesus uses the word for dog that refers to a pet dog and not a street dog. So, in other words, he's not using the same word that the Jews used in a derogatory way against the Gentiles. And I think he does that purposely to emphasize the fact that this is a parable. But see, here's the amazing thing about this. The woman gets it. She understands that this is a parable, and so she responds to Jesus using the same kind of language. Look again, verse 27. She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." See, she's not insulted by what Jesus said. She's not offended by the dog comment like we are. She understands perfectly what Jesus is doing here. And so she responds to Jesus with understanding and with faith. And get this, she is the first one to do so. Nobody else has been able to do this up until this point. Even the disciples need Jesus to explain to them what he means when he teaches them in parables, but not this woman. She gets it. And she gets it on the very first try. And by the way, how big of a parable is this? Is it a long one? No. It's one sentence, right? It's like the smallest parable in the whole gospel. And so compared to all of the other teachings that Jesus has given so far, this one is like a crumb. In fact, it is a crumb. And the woman in this story absolutely devours it. Think about all of the things that Jesus' disciples have witnessed so far. The calming of the storm, the healing of the demon-possessed men, the feeding of the 5,000, not to mention all of the parables they've heard and the hours and hours of teaching. I mean, they have literally been given a feast. And as Jesus said to his disciples last week in verse 16, "Are you still without understanding? Really, after everything that you have seen and heard, you still don't understand?" What is it about this woman that enabled her to hear and understand Jesus where the Pharisees and the crowds and even Jesus' own disciples failed to do so? What was so different about her? Because I'd really like to know, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you like to know the secret as to how this woman is able to understand exactly what Jesus is saying to her? Because I'm sure whatever it is, it could help us as we seek to see and understand Jesus as well. And so what is it? What's her secret? Well, let's take a look again at how she responds to Jesus and see if we can figure it out. The first thing she says to him here is what? Verse 27. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Before she says anything else, she says, yes, Lord. She agrees with Jesus. She acknowledges the fact that Jesus is smarter than she is. That he knows what he's talking about and that there's no point in arguing with him. Which is a different kind of response than what we've seen from people so far, isn't it? Certainly from the religious leaders. They didn't think that Jesus knew more than they did, not by a long shot. But even the disciples often questioned Jesus' judgment, didn't they? Remember when he told them to feed the 5,000? What did they say to that? Did they say, yes, Lord? Or did they make excuses? See, if we want to really be able to hear and understand what Jesus is saying to us, then we need to be willing to say, yes, Lord. Even if what he says is something we don't immediately agree with or understand. Because we acknowledge the fact that he is Lord and we are not. And that he's a lot smarter than we are. Now, I don't think any of us would dispute that fact. It's very rare to hear a Christian say that they think they're smarter than Jesus. But we do often live like we believe it's true, don't we? Well, I know what Jesus says about loving your enemies and all, but you've never met this guy, right? I know what I'm doing. Sometimes one of the reasons why we have trouble hearing what Jesus is saying to us is because we're already disagreeing with what he has to say before he even says it. But see, this woman wasn't like that. She said, yes, Lord, and she agreed with Jesus right out of the gate, even with his point that the gospel was for the Jews first. See, she didn't object to the idea of being categorized as one of the house pets in this parable. Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. In other words, you're right, Lord. They are like the kids and we are like the pets. They should be fed first. See, this woman was perfectly fine with the fact that Jesus was born among the Jews and not the Gentiles. And that he spent the vast majority of his time teaching them and healing them and performing miracles among them, and spent very little time with the Gentiles. She acknowledged the fact that the Jews were God's chosen people, and so she wasn't coming to Jesus with any sense of entitlement or any thought whatsoever that Jesus owed her anything. That's why her request was what? Verse 22. Have mercy on me. And that's the second thing we notice that's different about how this woman responds to Jesus. First, she agrees with Jesus and acknowledges the fact that he's Lord and that he's always right. And then secondly, she comes to Jesus with the understanding that she has no rights. Which means anything that Jesus does for me is based totally on his grace and his mercy and nothing else. See, if I come to Jesus believing that he owes me something because of something that I've done or because of who I am, then I'm really not going to understand what he has to say to me. Because anything he says to me is going to go through this filter of, well, if Jesus blesses me, it's because I'm a good person. And if he doesn't, well, then it's because I'm not. When the truth is, any blessing I do receive from Jesus isn't because I'm good, but because he is. And this woman recognized that. And so her request isn't based on her own position or her own merit, but it's based purely on her understanding of the compassion of Jesus, believing that he is both sovereign and good. In other words, she understands that not only is Jesus able to heal her daughter, but he's willing to as well. Incredible insight into the nature and character of God that this woman has. Which leads us to the last thing that makes her so different from everyone else that we've seen so far. And that's her understanding that Jesus alone is more than enough to meet her every need. Look one more time at what she says here in verse 27. Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. See, she's not even asking for a slice of bread. Did you notice that? She's just asking for a crumb. As far as this woman is concerned, just a crumb from Jesus' table is all that is needed to heal her little girl. I mean, that's just fascinating to me. That without ever seeing Jesus do a single thing, without ever seeing Jesus perform a single miracle or demonstrate his power in any way whatsoever, this woman is already convinced that Jesus is more than enough to meet her every need. I mean, how convinced are we of that? How convinced were the disciples? Remember, it was after seeing Jesus heal a man with leprosy by just touching him, and then watching him heal a centurion's daughter from a distance with just a word from his mouth, and then seeing him heal Peter's mother-in-law, not to mention everyone who was sick or demon-possessed that he met that evening in that town. It was after watching Jesus perform all of these incredible miracles that the disciples then freaked out in the middle of a storm because they thought their boat was going to be sinking, and Jesus was right there with them the whole time. And it was after seeing Jesus calm that storm and then continue to perform countless miracles of deliverance and healing that the disciples then began to question Jesus' judgment about feeding the 5,000. Think of all the miracles that the disciples have witnessed firsthand and then compared their faith to this woman's faith, who at least up until now, up until this point, hasn't witnessed a single thing. And yet she's convinced that just the crumbs from Jesus' table is more than she will ever need. Incredible faith. But simple faith. There's nothing complicated about it. What makes this woman so different isn't a PhD in theology or decades of experience in ministry. It's just simple faith in Jesus. Faith that enables her to come to him in absolute humility, acknowledging his lordship, recognizing her position as one who deserves nothing, but relies solely and completely on God's mercy and grace, while at the same time recognizing the fact that Jesus is more than she will ever need. I hope that this woman's simple faith in Jesus challenges you this morning as much as it has me, and encourages you to trust him more and to pursue him relentlessly just as she did, with a soft heart and a humble spirit and a genuine expectation that Jesus is all that we'll ever need. Amen. And so as the worship team makes their way back up,